All right, welcome back, everyone. So this is video 2 of part 2 of Intimations of a New Worldview, and this is a continuation of Mythology as a Collective Dream. So let's just get back into it. So to recap what we talked about last time. So in the last video, we discussed this idea of self-organized criticality. Self-organized criticality is the process by which complex systems in nature self-organize from the bottom up to that narrow window between order and chaos. And at that narrow window, they display avalanches, right, which are these little catastrophes, these little descents into chaos, and these avalanches can result in an increase in complexity. We discussed John Vervaeke's theory of relevance realization, which is the process by which we intelligently ignore irrelevant aspects of the world so that we can zero in on that small subset of the world that is relevant to us. Relevance realization involves the capacity for insight, and insight has been argued by other cognitive scientists to be a self-organized critical phenomenon. That is, insight occurs at the narrow window between order and chaos in the brain. And we'll discuss that idea more in part 4 because it has to do with the scientific study of consciousness as well. We discussed Eric Hol's theory, as a very recent theory published in 2021, that dreams function to help us construct more generalizable cognitive models of the world. They help us to avoid overfitting, right? That's a more technical way of talking about it. And I introduced the idea that mythological narratives might be performing a similar function, right? Narratives in general, fictions in general. That's what Eric Hol has argued elsewhere, that fictions and myth might be serving a similar function as to what dreams do for individuals. And so in this part of the series, we're going to go into quite a bit more detail about Jordan Peterson's thesis from Maps of Meaning, about the metamythology, about the general pattern underlying mythological narratives. And I'm going to make the case that that Jordan Peterson's thesis provides some support for Eric Hol's theory about the function of myth and other fictions, and we'll see how that has overlap with John Vervaeke's ideas about relevance realization as well. So let's get into it. So we've talked about this a little bit, but just to drive the point home, in Maps of Meaning, Jordan Peterson argued that mythological narratives have converged on this general pattern, and he calls this general pattern the metamythology, right? The mythology that is above the other mythologies. And so what does that general pattern look like? Well, it looks the same, as I talked about in the last video, it looks the same as the structure of an insight, and that's represented by the figure on the right. So you start out with some way that you're framing the world. That's how the cognitive scientists talk about it. Jordan talks about it in terms of a story. You have some story that you're enacting. You have some anomalous information which disrupts that story for whatever reason. And as a result of that anomalous information, you have a descent into chaos, right? A disintegration of your story. And as a result of voluntarily confronting that chaos, voluntarily intermingling with that chaos, you have a reemergence into a higher form of order. And so the metamythology represents the process by which individuals and cultures update themselves in the face of existential anomalies. Now, the metamythology, I will argue, and I've argued on my Substack, has characteristics indicating that it is essentially the same as the process that characterizes relevance realization described earlier. These include the facts that, in the first place, the metamythology occurs at the border between order and chaos. And we're going to look at how Jordan Peterson talks about that in Maps of Meaning here in a second. It has the same basic structure as an insight, which we've already discussed, and an insight is an integral aspect of relevance realization. And then Jordan Peterson explicitly describes the metamythology as the process by which we determine the motivational relevance of novel stimuli, which is just relevance realization. And we'll talk about that towards the end of this video. What's interesting about this overlap is that nowhere in Maps of Meaning, nowhere in his class lectures does Jordan Peterson refer to the science of self-organized criticality, right, which he couldn't have known about when writing Maps of Meaning. It was around when he was writing Maps of Meaning, but it was very obscure, and I seriously doubt he could have known anything about it. The self-organization of insight, which was a literature that didn't exist when he was writing Maps of Meaning, or John Vervaeke's theory of relevance realization, which also did not exist when he was writing Maps of Meaning. So these are true convergences, right? To the extent that these overlaps represent a real convergence, they're true convergences. They're not the intermingling of ideas. So we're first going to talk about this idea that the metamythology emerges at the border between order and chaos. And there are a number of passages in Maps of Meaning which indicate that this is the case. In the first place, Jordan has a lengthy discussion of Chinese Taoist philosophy, and he suggests that the Tao, which can be translated as the way, it's the way of being in the world, the Tao exists at the razor's edge between order and chaos. And the metamythology is also referred to as the way. And on page 281 of Maps of Meaning, Jordan says that the mythological hero figure is a narrative representation of the metamythology. And on page 284, he says that the hero stands at the border between order and chaos, right? So the metamythology also occurs at the border between order and chaos. Jordan also has a lengthy discussion of what he calls the constituent elements of experience, right? So he suggests that our phenomenology, right, our experience of the world can be divided into basically three categories. We'll talk about that here in a minute. There actually might be four categories. I'm going to ignore one for now. I think I'll come back to it later on. But it's not that important for my purposes here. Basically, there are three categories, and this also suggests that the hero stands at the border between order and chaos because that's one of those categories. So Peterson suggests throughout Maps of Meaning, right, the metamythology occurs at the border between order and chaos. So we're going to look at Taoism first, and I'm not going to discuss Jordan Peterson's discussion of Taoism. I'm going to discuss Alan Watts. Alan Watts wrote this book called Tao, the Watercourse Way. Alan Watts, if you're not familiar, is this kind of spiritual guru guy. He's become very popular on YouTube recently. He's been gone for a while, but his videos have become popular on YouTube. And he wrote this book called Tao, the Watercourse Way, and his discussion of Taoism in there has a lot of overlap with Jordan Peterson's discussion of Taoism. So in his book, Alan Watts says that yang and yin can be associated with dichotomies such as masculine and feminine, firm and yielding, light and dark, and rising and falling. Now, yang and yin, I'm going to go forward one slide and I'll come back. This is just a figure which depicts that famous symbol of the Tao. And yang and yin, this is from Maps of Meaning. Yang and yin are associated with order and chaos, masculinity and femininity, day and night, the known and the unknown. And that's how Jordan characterizes it. Watts says that yang is associated with firmness, yin with yielding, yang with light, yin with the dark, yang with rising, and yin with falling. And of course, firmness is something like maintaining structure, right? And that's order. And yielding is something like allowing the structure to dissolve, and that's chaos. Light is associated with the known, right? The light is the realm of the known, and that's order. Dark is the realm of the unknown, and that's chaos. Rising is what you do when you're in a state of order, right? When things are going well, when you know what you're doing, you rise, and you fall into a state of chaos, right? We never say you rise into a state of chaos. You fall into a state of chaos. We're going to see in a minute, in a few slides from now, we're going to see how masculine and feminine are also associated with these categories. And so for Jordan, the proper mode of being, he says, and I quote, "It takes place from the Oriental viewpoint on the path of meaning in Tao, balanced on the razor's edge between mythic masculine and mythic feminine, balanced between the potentially stultifying safety of order and the inherently destructive possibilities of chaos." John Vervaeke talks a lot about Taoism. He practices some things associated with Taoism, and he has said that Taoism is the philosophy of learning how to flow. And we're going to come back to that idea in part 9 when I talk about the psychology of meaning. But for now, it's important to point out that the flow state also occurs at the border between order and chaos. This is something that John has written about. It occurs at the border between boredom, on the one hand. If you're bored, you're not in the flow state. And if you're anxious, you're not in the flow state. And the flow state, by the way, is just the state that you can get into, especially if you're working on something or playing a sport that you're actively engaged in that is challenging you, where your sense of identity kind of drops away. You're not thinking about anything else. You're really just fully engaged with the activity. And it's like the right place to be. It's a very, it's been called optimal experience. So moving on to the eternal categories of experience. So Jordan Peterson in Maps of Meaning, he identifies what he calls these eternal categories of experience, and these make up the characters of mythological narratives. So I'm going to read something from the abstract of Maps of Meaning, which kind of summarizes this idea. In the abstract, Jordan Peterson says, and I quote, "Order is the natural category of all those phenomena whose manifestations and transformations are currently predictable. Chaos is the natural category of potential, the potential that emerges whenever an error in prediction occurs. the capacity for creative exploration, embodied in mythology in the form of the ever-resurrecting hero, serves as the mediator between these fundamental constituent elements of experience. And so these are the three eternal categories of experience, right? The known and the predictable, right? And that's order. The unknown and the unpredictable, and that's chaos. And then the process that mediates between them, and that's you. That's the knower. That's the individual. And so these eternal categories of experience have been represented mythologically in terms of these characters. That's what Jordan suggests. Now, it's important to point out here that not every narrative is going to line up with these characters perfectly, but you can see I think if you study these things enough, you will see the overall pattern is pretty clear. It's kind of like finding the line of best fit, right? You have to ignore some of the details. You can't be too precise about it. But we'll see in a minute. I'm going to look at some narratives here in just a minute, and we'll see how these categories fit pretty nicely with these narratives. And so order, that's the known, that's culture. Culture is represented mythologically as the Great Father. The Great Father is both protective and tyrannical, right? He protects you, the culture protects you, but also tyrannizes you and forces you to conform, right? So it has this ambivalent nature. Okay, so chaos. On the other hand, chaos is associated with the unknown. It's associated with nature. Nature is everything that exists outside of the predictability of culture, and it's represented by the Great Mother. The Great Mother is both creative on the one hand and destructive, right? So it also has this ambivalent nature. The Great Mother is the birthplace of everything new, the birthplace of all that is novel. And then there's the third category, right? So if you have the known and the unknown, you have that which can know, right? That's you, that's consciousness, that's the process that mediates between order and chaos, that's the individual. It's represented mythologically by the divine son, which also has this ambivalent character, which we'll get into here in a minute. So first we're going to talk about order, the Great Father, and how this is represented mythologically. So order is associated with culture and nature with chaos. And I don't think we need to think about this in like metaphysical terms, right? There may not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily need to be the case that there's some kind of metaphysical split between culture and nature. But it is still useful to differentiate between those aspects of the world that have been rendered relatively safe and relatively predictable because of the actions of our ancestors, right? And that's our culture, right? So we have, modern medicine and air conditioning and a police force and all this stuff that is meant to keep us safe and keep our world highly predictable and all this stuff. And that's a product of our culture. And then there's everything that exists outside of that, right? There's everything that exists outside of our protective bubble of relative safety and predictability, and that's nature in this framework. And so it's for that reason that culture is associated with order, with predictability, and nature with chaos. So why is order masculine? And this is something that Jordan caught flack from people who were probably, willfully misunderstanding him because they think that it's misogynistic, right, to associate chaos with nature, or chaos with the feminine. And that's wrong because chaos is not a bad thing unless you're an idiot, right? If you're an idiot, then chaos is a bad thing. But if you're not an idiot, then you understand that chaos and the unknown is necessary and has this promising aspect to it. And we'll talk more about that here in a minute. But why is order masculine? So there are multiple reasons for this. And I'm not going to talk about all of them here. I'm just going to talk about one that I think is important. So Roy Baumeister is this psychologist. He's a very prominent psychologist. He wrote this book in 2010 called Is There Anything Good About Men? And in that book, he has a discussion of why culture has always been associated with men and masculinity. He's far from the first to make that case, but it's a relatively recent and nice discussion of it. So I'm going to quote him here. He says about this, and I quote, "It's not that men are smarter than women. It's about some basic likes and dislikes. It's rooted in how men treat other men and how that is different from the way women relate to other women. It's about how culture works. Culture grew out of the way that men related to each other more than out of women's relationships. There were crucial trade-offs. Women's relationships were vital for some other things, just not for constructing large systems like a market economy or a large team. Because culture grew out of men's relationships, including competition, trading, and communicating with strangers and ample doses of violence, men were always in charge of it." And so what are those relationships between men that facilitate the advent of large cultural systems, right? Complex cultural systems. So the developmental psychologist Joyce Benenson, she has this book called Warriors and Worriers, and Warriors and Worriers. And did I differentiate? Okay, Warriors and Worriers. Okay, and she describes how even from a very young age, boys form themselves into these flexible hierarchies of competence in the service of their shared goals in a way that girls typically don't. Girls tend to maintain more egalitarian relations with their peers. And so I've written about this, and so I'll just quote what I said about this before. Benenson reviews evidence that boys more readily form large, resilient coalitions to play competitive team games. Girls tend to form smaller groups while their games are less competitive and they don't tend to last as long. Part of boys' ability to form these longer-lasting, larger groups is their propensity for forming hierarchies. Boys tend to naturally put themselves into a leader-follower dynamic, while girls tend to maintain more egalitarian relationships. And it is the case that all stable social structures are characterized by flexible, hierarchical leader-follower dynamics. And of course, it is definitely the case that hierarchies can become rigid and corrupt over time, or they can fall apart. But if a really stable social structure has to be characterized by a relatively flexible, hierarchical structure. And it is boys who tend to put themselves in that kind of structure. Now, if you're somebody who, there are some people who think that like all the differences between boys and girls are just learned and are culturally imposed and there's no natural differences. And this is wrong. Okay. If you think that, you're like definitely wrong. And, I'm not going to sit here and go through all the evidence for this. You're like 30 years behind the scientific research on this stuff. And, you should catch up a little bit. Joyce Benenson, in her, sorry, I shouldn't be so mean about that, but it gets a little old in psychology hearing this stuff rehashed all the time, despite the fact that we have overwhelming evidence for very clear, biologically mediated differences in the way that boys and girls develop. So Joyce Benenson reviews evidence that boys do this pretty naturally, right? And they put themselves in these hierarchies of competence pretty naturally. And so I'm going to quote her here. She says, and I quote, "Amazingly, the U.S. Army is organized the same way that 7-year-old boys are organized. While the Army probably prides itself on having thought up such a clever arrangement, the boys thought of it first. Actually, this kind of organization has existed for millennia in various armies. Could boys have somehow learned about this? Well, since most boys couldn't describe exactly what they were doing, and certainly there is no evidence that they have much contact with military expertise in their early primary school years, this is very unlikely. And instead, boys and young men appear to have an innate biological intuition about the best way to organize competitive groups." End quote. So it's like an instinct, right? It's like an instinct in the same way that beavers instinctually build dams. There's these like really cute videos on YouTube of people who have rescued young beavers, right? Young beavers who have never interacted with other beavers and they've never seen a dam potentially. And the beavers, when they come of age, they start building dams in the house, right? So they start like grabbing items and damming up the hallway or damming up doorways and stuff like that. We have instinctual behaviors, and this is one of those, right? The propensity to put ourselves into these flexible hierarchies of competence in the service of our shared goals. It's like an instinct. So Jordan Peterson, in this Akira the Dawn video called The Spirit of the Father, describes his thought process in looking at this symbolic representation of the Great Father, right? So why is culture depicted as this judgmental father figure, right? This father figure who protects you on the one hand, tyrannizes you on the other, but is also a judge. And Jordan Peterson says about this, and I'm going to quote him at length here. He says, and I quote, "One of the things I do is to look at symbolic representations through the lens of evolutionary biology, rather than assuming that these representations are mere superstitions or play no function. We have this idea that there's a deity that's father-like. So it's a disembodied spirit that's eternal and has paternal characteristics. If you strip this representation of its metaphysics and just look at it as a biological phenomenon, then what might the idea that there's an eternal paternal spirit mean? Well, there's you imitating your father, and your father imitated his father, who imitated his father, and so on. So in some sense, what you're actually imitating is the pattern of fathers across time. You can think of the transcendent father as the pattern of fathers across time. It's a disembodied spirit that's incarnated in the pattern of fathers across time. And what is that? Well, it's a judge. even when you interact with the hierarchy of men that are currently alive, something can be abstracted out of that, and it's like the patriarchal spirit. And if you don't think that's judging you, you're not thinking. It's absolutely judging you, and it's what rank orders you in a hierarchy, right? So anytime that you interact with, that's the end of the quote, anytime you interact with one of these hierarchies, right, you're being judged. You're being judged based on your competence and your capacity to contribute to the shared goal. And that spirit, right, that spirit of the judgmental father is always judging you. That's what your culture does. But it also helps you to develop, right, because it wants you, in a healthy culture anyways, it wants you to become somebody who can contribute to the shared goal. Now, that poses a real problem if a culture doesn't have any shared goal, right, which is the state that we're in right now culturally. We'll talk about that a lot more later on. Moving on to chaos, the great mother. So why is it that chaos or nature might be represented as a great mother? And again, just like with order, there's multiple reasons for this. I'm not going to talk about all of them. I'm just going to talk about one that I think is important. Chaos can be thought of as the birthplace of everything new. Right? Everything new must emerge. Everything that's truly novel must emerge out of chaos. Nietzsche dramatically said that one must still have chaos in oneself in order to give birth to a dancing star. Nietzsche loved to put things very dramatically. And there are good reasons for why chaos is necessary to give birth to new forms. And we're going to talk about that in the context of what's called dynamical systems theory. So in the previous video, in the first video of this part of the series, I discussed the structure of an insight. And the structure of an insight is characterized by this temporary increase in entropy when you break the frame, right? So you have a way that you're framing the world, you break that frame, you have an increase in behavioral entropy, which is like a little descent into chaos. And that's followed by a reemergence into a state that has less entropy than before, right? So you reemerge into a higher form of order. Now that basic pattern is the structure not only of an insight, it's the structure of all far from equilibrium phase changes. I talk about this in one of my Substack articles at some length, and I'll put the link to that in the description. It's called Existential Threats as a Non-Zero-Sum Game. So in order for complex systems to radically transform, they have to have a descent into chaos, right? It's necessary. And you may ask why, right? Why is chaos necessary for novelty to arise in a complex system, for a phase change to occur? And I think the easiest way to visualize this comes from dynamical systems theory. Dynamical systems theory construes the state of a system as movement through phase space. So you can visualize how a system can move from one attractor to another in phase space, and that's what a phase change is. So a phase change can be thought of as movement from one shallow attractor to a deeper attractor. And we can understand why chaos is necessary for this to occur, why entropy is necessary for this to occur. So phase spaces can be visualized as a landscape. This is often visualized in 3 dimensions, but I'm going to use 2 dimensions here, with basins called attractors, right? So little basins called attractors, and hills called repellers. And attractors are states that the system has a tendency to revisit and to stay in when it visits them, right? It's like a state of that keeps the system in one place. And so a phase change can be thought of as movement from a shallow attractor to a deeper attractor. And if we visualize this movement, it can help us to understand why instability, entropy, chaos is necessary for it to take place. So in the image below, in the image at the bottom of this slide here, the red ball is the state of the system, right? And it's stuck in attractor A. And attractor B is a deeper and more functional attractor. And so the question is, how can we get this red ball from attractor A to attractor B? Well, Alicia Juarrero wrote a book called Dynamics in Action, where she has a lot of discussion of complex systems theory. And she says, and I quote, "Complex systems don't wander out of a deep basin of attraction. For phase changes to occur, the current landscape must show signs of flattening out. It must first become unstable." And so one way you can think about how this ball can move from attractor A to attractor B is that the landscape has to become flat temporarily, right? It has to temporarily flatten out. And then when it temporarily flattens out, the ball can potentially roll from attractor A to attractor B. That's a very simple way of thinking about it. But this characterizes, so this is what happens in an insight. And in part 4, we'll talk about how psilocybin mushrooms, which have been studied a lot recently scientifically, they induce this kind of entropy in the brain, and that can help people to escape non-optimal attractors. They're very good at helping people to quit smoking, for example. that can help people to escape non-optimal attractors and move to a more functional attractor. And they do that by injecting entropy, injecting noise, let's say, into the brain. So, as I said, that flattening out, it's equivalent to an increase in entropy, which is the same thing as a descent into chaos. And so there must be a temporary period of chaos or a temporary period of entropy before a phase change, and that represents the emergence of a novel form, right? That's what a phase change represents in this context. So in the image to the right, on the image on the right side of the screen here, the Great Mother is represented as novelty, as that anomalous information, the ambivalent anomalous information, because a real anomaly is ambivalent, right? You don't know whether it's promising or threatening, right? It has this ambivalent character. And so she represents chaos, but she also represents the potential, right? Potential for something new to emerge. She represents novelty or instability. And like I said, in the context of dynamical systems theory, which describes how complex systems change over time, and we are a complex system like that. We are a complex adaptive system. Dynamical systems theory describes how we change over time as well. It really is the case that entropy or instability is both promising and threatening, right? Promising because it has the potential to allow you to escape from a non-optimal attractor and to find a better way of being in the world, but also threatening because sometimes chaos just causes people to fall apart and to stay falling apart, right? Not everybody puts themselves back together. And sometimes, of course, people just die, right? And so our job, right, our role, if we're thinking about this in terms of the mythological narratives, right? Our role as the representative of the mythological hero, which will be the next category that we talk about, is to have the right relationship with chaos or novelty or the Great Mother, right? We need to have a good relationship with uncertainty. And so the psychologist Abraham Maslow describes that relationship. So he was somebody who studied, many psychologists study psychopathology. And Abraham Maslow studied the healthiest people he could find, what he called self-actualizing people who were fulfilling their potential in the world. And this is what he said about their relationship to chaos or the unknown. And I quote, "Self-actualizing people are relatively unfrightened by the unknown, the mysterious, the puzzling, and often are positively attracted by it. That is, they selectively pick it out to puzzle over, to meditate on, and to be absorbed with. They do not neglect the unknown, or deny it, or run away from it, or try to make believe that it is really known, nor do they organize, dichotomize, or rubricize it prematurely. They do not cling to the familiar, nor is their quest for the truth a catastrophic need for certainty, safety, definiteness, and order. They can be, when the total objective situation calls for it, comfortably disorderly, sloppy, anarchic, chaotic, vague, doubtful, uncertain, indefinite, approximate, inexact, or inaccurate. All of these at certain moments in science, art, or life in general are quite desirable." And that is the case, right? So you need to be orderly, right? In some sense, right? People, you need some orders, a routine, stability. But the really self-actualizing person, the really creative person, is also capable of being chaotic when necessary and of having a good relationship with chaos, with uncertainty. And so many people think of chaos as a bad thing, but that's wrong, right? It's wrong. It's not a bad thing. It's the birthplace of everything new, and developing a good relationship with that is necessary for optimal development. So the third category, right? The third eternal category of experience is the process that mediates between order and chaos, right? And that's you, and that's consciousness. And we'll talk about that more in part 4, but that's you, right? That's the individual. It's represented mythologically as both the hero and the adversary. So the hero is narrative representation of the process of creative exploration, right? The meta-mythology, right? Which occurs at the border between order and chaos. The adversary, the mythological adversary, is narrative representation of the denial of that process. So I'll read what Jordan Peterson wrote about this in The Abstract to Maps of Meaning, and I quote, "The capacity for creative exploration, embodied in mythology in the form of the ever-resurrecting hero, serves as the eternal mediator between the fundamental constituent elements of experience. Voluntary failure to engage in such exploration, that is, forfeit of identification with the world-redeeming Savior, produces a chain of causally interrelated events, whose inevitable endpoint is the adoption of a rigid, ideology-predicated, totalitarian identity and violent suppression of the eternally threatening other." The adversary, right? And that latter part of that description is describing the adversary. The adversary can take one of two forms. And these two forms represent either an excess of order or an excess of chaos, right? So we talked about, self-organized criticality being the border between order and chaos. And you can fall off towards too much order on the one hand, or you can fall off towards too much chaos on the other. And what Jordan Peterson calls the fascist is somebody who has fallen off towards order. The fascist is somebody who clings desperately to tradition and to the security of the group. The decadent, on the other hand, is somebody who falls off towards chaos. And the decadent is more subversive than the fascist. The decadent rejects all culture and tradition simply because he is too undisciplined to adhere to their strictures. The fascist is characterized by a desperate, although generally speaking, unconscious fear of the unknown. And in that fear, and because of that fear, he attempts to crush anything that is different or anyone that is different. The decadent, on the other hand, rejects all order, all tradition, all stability, and all culture. And this may seem like it's far removed from the fascist, but in fact, the decadent is just as arrogant and just as rigid as his more apparently conservative counterpart. Jordan Peterson says about this, and I quote, "The pitfalls of fascism and decadence may be avoided through identification with the hero, the true individual. The hero organizes the demands of social being and the responsibilities of his own soul into a coherent, hierarchically arranged unit. He stands on the border between order and chaos and serves the group as creator and agent of renewal. The hero's voluntary contact with the unknown transforms it into something benevolent, into the eternal source, in fact, of strength and ability." And that's what we're here to do, right? That's what we're here to enact. So, I talked a little bit about how all of these categories have an ambivalence, right? And I just want to drive that point home here. Order and culture can be both protective, and it definitely protects us, right? It protects us from the terrible aspects of nature, right? From disease and predators and the elements in general, right? That's what our culture does for us. We come into the world with a certain amount of privilege, you might say. We're privileged to live in a place where we get 3 square meals a day and we have air conditioning and all this stuff. But of course, culture also tyrannizes you, right? It forces you to conform. It forces you to sacrifice your individuality to some extent. And some cultures do that more than others, but all cultures must do it to some degree. So your culture protects you, it helps you to develop, but it simultaneously demands your conformity. Chaos, or nature, also has this dual aspect, right? As we've talked about, chaos represents an opportunity, right? It represents an opportunity to move from a non-optimal solution to a better solution to whatever problem may be occurring. And it's also a crisis, right? It's also a crisis because it's inherently destructive as well, right? And things don't always solve their problems, right? Sometimes they just fall apart. So some key ideas we want to extract from this. The mythological hero stands at the border between order and chaos. That's the right place to be. It's, if we're talking about in terms of self-organized criticality, which I'll come back to at the end of this video, it's the optimal place to be, right? It's where you want to be. And in effect, this means that the mythological hero voluntarily engages in the process by which order is renewed when necessary, and that means voluntary confrontation with or descent into chaos. This process manifests as a particular pattern of behavior, which is understood as the most general pattern of optimal behavior, and we'll talk more about that as we go. So we're now going to look at some narratives. We're going to look at some particular narratives and see how this process lines up with some particular mythological narratives. So just an overview of what the metamythology looks like. At the beginning, you have a pre-existing state of stability, some relative stability to begin the story. And there's an anomaly that comes along, some kind of anomalous information or event that threatens the stability of that state, of that stable state. As a result of the anomaly, right, the stable state dissolves into chaos, and generally speaking, the hero of the story has to go confront that chaos in one way or another. And through that voluntary confrontation with chaos, there's a reemergence into a higher form of order, right? That's the basic pattern of the metamythology. And so we're going to look at that, how that pattern manifests in some ancient mythological narratives. The first one I want to look at is the Enuma Elish. The Enuma Elish is the Babylonian or Mesopotamian story of Marduk. Marduk is the culture hero. And so at the beginning of the story, Tiamat and Apsu, give birth to the elder gods, and Tiamat is like the feminine representative of chaos. And Apsu is relatively underdeveloped in the story. He's not described in any amount of detail, but we can infer, and I think that inference is highly plausible given how the story plays out and given its relation to other stories, that Apsu is a representative of order. And so the elder gods, so they give birth to the elder gods, and the elder gods are like basically causing a ruckus, right? They're being a little bit unruly. And so Apsu and Tiamat conspire to devour them. And as a result of that conspiracy to devour the elder gods, one of the elder gods kills Apsu, and he kills order. Tiamat is not pleased by this, and she redoubles her efforts to go to war with the gods, right? And god after god fails to defeat Tiamat. They fail to defeat chaos. And eventually Marduk comes along, and Marduk speaks magic words and has eyes and ears all around his head, and he volunteers to face Tiamat. But he only does this if the other gods will agree to put him in charge should he succeed. And he goes out and he defeats Tiamat, and then he creates the world out of her pieces, right? So he defeats Tiamat, and then out of the pieces of her, he creates the habitable world. And so we see that at the beginning of the story, right, there's some relative stability, but the elder gods are being unruly. They're acting inappropriately. And so, as often happens, we see this in the Bible with God and the flood. God or the gods conspire to do away with the elder gods, and as a result of that, they kill order, right? They kill Apsu, right? They disrupt the current order, and because that current order has been disrupted, chaos ensues, right? Tiamat, who is chaos ensues and causes all sorts of problems, and eventually Marduk comes along. Marduk volunteers, right? He volunteers to go out and confront that chaos. And Marduk is somebody who had eyes and ears all around his head, and he spoke magic words. And Jordan Peterson makes the case that he's a representative of consciousness, of conscious awareness, and the ability to articulate yourself, the logos, let's say. And so he's a representative of masculine consciousness, and he voluntarily confronts that chaos, and from that interaction constructs the habitable world. That's a reemergence into a higher mode of being. Let's say it's the story of the creation of the world itself. All right, so the second narrative we're going to talk about here is the story of Osiris and Isis and Horus from Egypt. And Horus is the mythological hero figure in this story. So at the beginning of the story, Osiris is a primeval king, a mythical primeval king, and he ruled Egypt justly and fairly. In some versions of the story, not all versions, according to Mircea Eliade, in some versions of the story, Osiris has sex with Seth's wife. We'll see why that's important here in a minute. So he may be a little bit corrupt too, but he's generally a just and fair king, but he was blind to the forces of tyranny in his midst. And his brother Seth rose up against him. And there's a lot of overlap between this story and the story of the Lion King. It's kind of like how Scar rose up against Mufasa in the Lion King, because Mufasa was blind to what was clearly a very corrupt and power-hungry brother of his. And so Seth kills Osiris, right? Seth kills Osiris, sends him to the underworld, and dismembers his body. Apparently, it's really hard to kill a god, so he doesn't fully kill him, but he sends him to the underworld, and he dismembers his body, and he spreads his body parts across the kingdom. Isis, who is Mother Nature, who is the nature goddess and Osiris's wife, Isis gathers up Osiris's pieces, and then she makes herself pregnant with his phallus. And out of that union, she gives birth to Horus, who is the hero of the story. And Horus goes on to challenge Seth, defeating him. So Horus defeats Seth, but he loses an eye in the process, so he's injured in the process. And the story could have ended there. And it would have made sense, right? So Horus could have defeated Seth, and then Horus could have gone on to become the new king. But after he defeats Seth, he decides to go down into the underworld, and he finds his father Osiris, and he gives his father his dismembered eye so that his father can see again, because his father was blind. And then he brings his father back up, and they rule the kingdom together. So Osiris, of course, in the story represents order and tradition, right? He's the representative of past heroic deeds. He's the great father, but he's blind to the dangers of the present, right? Because that's what tradition is always like. Tradition is always blind to the problems of the present. It's necessary, but it still needs to be united with a conscious awareness of the present. And so Seth, the adversary, disrupts the current order in his blind pursuit of power. And of course, Osiris could have prevented this if he wasn't so blind, but Seth rises up against him, and he causes this descent into chaos, right, where the current order is broken up, and that's what happens to Osiris. He's broken up. And Isis, who is Mother Nature, who is the great mother and the positive aspect of the feminine, the positive aspect of chaos, she intermingles with the old order. And out of that union comes something new, something novel, which is Horus. And Jordan Peterson comments on this, and he says about it, and I quote, "This story makes a profound point. The degeneration of the state or domain of order and its descent into chaos serves merely to fructify that domain and to make it pregnant. In chaos lurks great potential." And that is the case, right? We've talked about why that's the case, why when you have some breakdown, right, it's actually, it is a crisis, but it's also potential. It's the potential for a phase change to occur, for something novel to emerge. And so Horus confronts Seth, right? He confronts the tyranny. He's harmed in the process, because that is what happens when you confront chaos or tyranny. But he's ultimately victorious, and then he voluntarily goes down into the underworld, right? So this is kind of the second part of the story. He goes down into the underworld, down into chaos, to rescue his tradition, because the optimal mode of being, this story suggests, it's something like the unification of tradition with the conscious awareness of the present, right? So he rescues his tradition, he rescues his father, and then he reemerges into a new and higher form of order in which the hero, the conscious awareness of the present, is united with the tradition, with the great father, right? That's how you would interpret this story within this framework anyways. So the third narrative I want to talk about is the story of the Buddha. So the Buddha, whose name was Siddhartha Gautama, is a prince. His father is an emperor. And his father hears about this prophecy, which says that Siddhartha is either going to grow up to be a great sage or a great emperor. And his father wants him to follow in his footsteps. He wants him to go on to become an emperor. And so because of this, he tries to provide him with a very pleasurable lifestyle and to protect him from suffering. And he thinks that will keep him from wanting to go be a sage. And eventually, however, so he puts him in a city that's safe, and there's no old people or sick people, and there's lots of beautiful women. And so Siddhartha is getting everything he may want out of life, right? But eventually, Siddhartha is exposed to suffering and sickness and death, right? He's exposed to these anomalies, and this causes something like an existential crisis for Siddhartha. He has this descent into psychological chaos. And as a result of that existential crisis, he leaves the protection of his home and he goes on this spiritual journey to find the solution to the problem of suffering. And he tries out many paths and he becomes a master of many traditions. And eventually he has his insight, right? Beneath the tree, he has his insight. He becomes enlightened. He becomes the Buddha, which means the enlightened one. And he has the choice, right? He could just stick around and be enlightened and have nirvana, or he could come and try to share his insight with the community. And that's what he chooses to do. He chooses to come back and to attempt to communicate his insight with the community. So at the beginning of the story, right, Gautama is kept in a city with beautiful women, delicious food, and no old or sick people to disrupt this paradisal state, right? His father, there's no coincidence, his father wants to maintain stability at all costs, right? And he's trying to protect him from the outside world. As is always the case, Siddhartha is exposed to the anomalies, right? He's exposed to suffering and death, and he has the descent into chaos, and he voluntarily confronts that chaos. He voluntarily leaves the current order and seeks out a solution to his problems, and then he returns to the community, right? And so we see the order, the anomaly, the voluntary confrontation with chaos, the voluntary expulsion from order, and the reemergence into a higher form of order. All right, the last one I want to talk about here is the biblical story. And the Bible is an interesting one because it contains this structure across the entire Bible, but it also Christ is kind of a microcosm of it. And so at the beginning of the Bible, we have Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, right? This is like the pre-adventure paradisal state. And it's a walled garden. And Jordan Peterson's interpretation of this, which I think is interesting and plausible, is that a walled garden is like the optimal balance between culture and nature, between order and chaos, right? Because it has walls, it's protected, and that's culture, but it also allows nature to grow up through it, right? So it's like the optimal balance between culture and nature. And as is always the case, there is a snake in the garden, right? There's an anomaly. And as a result of their intermingling with this anomaly, Adam and Eve are expelled into the history, the chaos of history. And at the end of the Bible, we see that there's a reestablishment of paradise. So lots of stuff happens in between, but of course, at the end of the Bible in Revelation, we see that there's a reestablishment of paradise on earth with God himself there to wipe every tear. That's what it says in Revelation. And so we see this initial state of stability and order, the anomaly that causes the descent into chaos, and then the reemergence into a higher form of order. And Christ's life also seems to play out this way. So, of course, Christ was doing his thing. He was going around healing and all this stuff, and he was betrayed, right? And a betrayal is, in some sense, I think, the worst kind of anomaly that you can experience, right? To be betrayed by somebody is, especially somebody who you trust, somebody who is your friend. This is probably the worst kind of anomaly that you can experience. And as a result of his betrayal, he experiences what is perhaps the ultimate kind of entropy, right? He dies, right? He's tortured and murdered. And nevertheless, he is resurrected, right? And so we see, again, we see stability, anomaly, descent into chaos, reemergence into a higher form of order. And of course, we see this story all the time, right, in different forms. This is the hero's journey, basically. And the hero's journey is a little more complicated than that, because there's also, the meaning, generally speaking, in more differentiated stories, right? So in mythological narratives, it tends to be relatively simple, and there are good reasons for that, why they tend to become very abstract. But in our more differentiated narratives that we go see in the movies and that we read novels about, right? There's usually, the meeting of a mentor and all sorts of things that happen, right? All the trials and tribulations that happen to the heroes of these stories, right? So we see this with Luke in Star Wars. At the beginning of the story, he's in a relatively stable place on Tatooine. He's being raised by his aunt and uncle. He meets Ben and he refuses the call, which is often the case. They refuse the call to adventure. But then, the anomaly occurs. He meets these droids and his parents or his aunt and uncle are killed. And so he has to go on this adventure and this long descent into chaos, let's say. And at the end of the story, right, in the third movie, he's not the same person he was before, right? He's a very different kind of person, far more confident and far more competent. And we see this in Harry Potter. We see it in the Matrix movies with Neo. We see it with Frodo from Lord of the Rings. We see it in The Lion King with Simba. We see it in these superhero movies that are extremely popular in our culture, right? Iron Man is a very sort of typical hero's journey. And so this story, right, this general pattern, it appeals to us, right? If we don't have it, we create it. There's something about it that's extremely... it's extremely entertaining and appealing, and for whatever reason, we like to see different versions of this story play out, and we'll pay lots of money to do that, and we'll create entire the Comic-Con thing, the whole. It's almost it's a quasi-religious experience for many people. So this is just a rehash of the basic pattern, sort of stripped of its frills, right? Order, anomaly, descent into chaos, reemergence into a higher order. Now, in Maps of Meaning, Jordan Peterson made this suggestion. It wasn't original to him. Nietzsche said something very similar. Carl Jung said something very similar. But Jordan Peterson suggested that our discovery of new ways of being in the world, our discovery of new patterns of action, occurs through a process of abstraction, right? So in the first place, we act out the idea, right? So we don't have the idea first and then act it out, right? We act it out first. We engage in somebody engages some kind of creative behavior, some kind of creative and admirable behavior. And then that person is imitated, right? We admire people who engage in creative, admirable behavior. And when we admire somebody, we imitate them. We do this basically unconsciously. It's like an instinct. The cultural evolutionists talk about this all the time, right? We imitate prestigious people. And children play, right? Children imitate prestigious people when they play. They imitate their cultural models in their pretend play, and we encode these patterns of action into rituals and drama and myth, and eventually full-blown religions, and eventually we make it more abstract by making it philosophical, right? So we might have some kind of philosophical argument about the right way to be in the world, and the final step in this process is to make it fully scientific, right? Is to make it empirical. Of course, that's what I'm attempting to do in this series of videos. And so in this way, Jordan says, the image of the hero, step by step, becomes ever clearer and ever more broadly applicable. And so an important question for Jordan then was how this process may have been acted out initially. And he has a kind of lengthy discussion about this in Maps of Meaning. So he argues that this process was acted out by the ancient figure of the shaman. And the shaman is generally talked about as being a religious figure, but I think that's not really the right way to think about it, because when we think about religion, we think about it as generally something that's kind of separate from the rest of our lives, right? So like we have a separation of church and state, and lots of people go to church on Sunday and then they live their lives the way they would anyways for the rest of the week, right? And so we think of religion as this thing that you do, that you can choose to do or not choose to do. But this is definitely not how our ancestors were thinking about it. Like what we would call religion was just their whole worldview, right? It was the water that they swam in, right? So they didn't have some divide between science and religion, or scientific ways of thinking and religious ways of thinking. They just had thinking, and some of their thinking we would now call religious, but they wouldn't have thought about it that way. And so the shaman was really just a kind of cultural leader who engaged in rituals and was a healer and things like that. So one of the things that Jordan points out is that, and we'll talk about, Jordan is far from the first to make the case for this, but that many people who would go on to become shamans in these cultures had what's called an initiatory crisis. They had a kind of psychological breakdown before they would go on to become the shaman. And Jordan suggested that this shamanic initiatory crisis represented the process by which an individual would update himself first in the face of some kind of existential anomaly, and then would go on to update his culture as well. And so he said this about it, and I quote, "The archaic shamanic initiate was commonly someone that was uniquely marked by fate. His unique personality or experiential history, in combination with presently extant social conditions, doomed him to experience so anomalous that it could not be simultaneously accepted as actually occurring, as real, and as possible within the confines determined by ruling social presumption. The existence of this experience, if admitted and processed, therefore presented a potentially fatal challenge to the perceived validity of the axioms currently underlying the maintenance of normal sanity. The existence of this distinct experience served as a gateway to the unknown, or as a floodgate, a portal, through which the unexpected could pour, with inevitably destructive and potentially creative consequences. The shaman is the individual who chooses to meet such a flood head on." And so what he's arguing here, what he's suggesting, with reference largely to the work of people like Mircea Eliade and Henry Ellenberger, is that the shaman is somebody who is exposed to some kind of anomalous experience, whether it's because of their personality or because of some actual experience that they had. And that experience cannot be admitted as real within the confines of what their culture considers sanity, right? And so they essentially lose their mind. And he goes on to discuss this, and I quote, "The future shaman is in fact tormented by the incomplete or self-contradictory state of his cultural structure as it is intrapsychically represented. He is undergoing a breakdown induced by some aspect of personal experience, some existential anomaly that cannot be easily integrated into that structure. This breakdown re-exposes him to the unknown, previously covered, so to speak, by his culture. His comportment during the period of incubation preceding his emergence as shaman is generally marked by commission of acts considered characteristic in modern and archaic culture alike of serious mental breakdown." Okay, the shaman goes nuts, basically. And this is the case. You'll see this in the anthropological literature. There's lots of descriptions of people who go on to become shamans who have serious mental breakdowns in the period preceding their emergence as shaman. This is talked about by it's been talked about by quite a few researchers. I'm going to read a few things here. So Mircea Eliade is a very prominent historian of religion. He's written many books on the history of religion. And he discusses the shamanic initiatory crisis in a couple places. I'm going to read something that he said about that. And I quote, "The total crisis of the future shaman, sometimes leading to complete disintegration of the personality and to madness, can be evaluated not only as an initiatory death, but also as a symbolic return to the pre-cosmogonic chaos, to the amorphous and indescribable state that precedes any cosmogony. Now, as we know, for archaic and traditional cultures, a symbolic return to chaos is equivalent to preparing a new creation. It follows that we may interpret the psychic chaos of the future shaman as a sign that the profane man is being dissolved and a new personality being prepared for birth." And so Mircea Eliade here is explicitly linking this to a descent into chaos, right? A descent into psychological chaos, which can allow for something potentially better to emerge. Joseph Polemony more recently, so Eliade wrote that in 1965. More recently, Joseph Polemony is a scientist. I think he's a psychiatrist, although I do forget exactly what he did. But he's a scientist anyways, and he wrote this book called Shamans Among Us, linking schizophrenia and psychosis to the practice of shamanism. And this is what he said about that, and I quote, "A perusal of the anthropological literature on shamanism reveals a repeated pattern of psychotic experiences occurring unexpectedly in young people soon to become shamans." He goes on a little later to say that people with a biological propensity towards psychosis were almost always placed in the role of shaman. And he's far from the first to make that claim, and others have made it since him. So Ross and McKay, in a recent commentary on a behavioral and brain sciences paper by Manveer Singh. Manveer Singh published a BBS paper in 2018 on shamanism, and this was part of their commentary on that paper. They said, and I quote, "Converging lines of evidence suggest that the positive symptoms of psychosis, particularly delusions and hallucinations, lie at the extreme end of a continuum of psychosis-like phenomena in the general population. We propose that individuals nearer the psychosis end of this psychosis continuum are more likely to become shamans than people who are not." So what's interesting about this, one of the things that's interesting about this, is that there is some evidence that this process that was described by Jordan Peterson, and it's really interesting that Paris Williams, so Paris Williams is a clinical psychologist who did his dissertation on people who recovered from psychosis. And he was somebody who himself experienced psychotic breaks early in his life and made a full recovery. Now, the problem with doing this kind of research is that there aren't very many research subjects available because, in the first place, recovery from psychosis is not extremely rare, but it's not extremely common either. So maybe something like a fourth of people, depends on how you measure recovery, but something like a quarter of people make what you might call a full recovery from psychosis. The problem with studying those people is that when they recover, they're no longer in the system, right? So almost all of our research on schizophrenia, psychosis, and things like that, almost all of our research occurs on people who are either having their first episode or people who are long-term psychiatric patients. And so people who recovered, they're just not in the system. They're not available for research. And so it's hard to do really quantitative research on them. And so the only research we really have is qualitative, which is a problem. We would like to have, quantitative research, but we work with what we've got. And it is interesting, Paris Williams's dissertation was very interesting in that his conclusions, and I do think that they follow from his interviews with his patients. So he conducted in-depth interviews with 6 individuals who had recovered from psychosis. And this is what he said about it in his conclusion, and I quote, "The most central implications that emerged from the findings with regard to all participants are as follows. An overwhelming existential threat to the self apparently played an important role in the onset of psychosis. The psychotic process was likely initiated by the psyche as an attempt to regain equilibrium in the face of this threat. Recovery was primarily assisted by reconnecting with hope, meaning, a sense of agency, and the cultivation of healthy relationships. Psychiatry generally caused significantly more harm than benefit in the process of recovery, and the successful resolution of the psychotic process apparently involved a profound reorganization of the self, along with significantly more lasting benefits than harms." Now, I expect for most people who are familiar with the mainstream takes on psychosis to be very skeptical of that conclusion. I'm a little bit less skeptical of it. than I think most people would be. So I had to think a little bit about whether I was going to include this stuff in this video, because of course, if you watch the first video in this series, you'll know that I had 3 psychotic breaks in my early 20s. And it is a little weird to talk about this stuff given that, but I thought it was necessary to include it in the first place because it was an important part of Jordan's thesis, but also I just think it's really interesting. If I'm being honest, I think it's very interesting. And I do find this thesis plausible because the way that Williams is describing his 6 individuals' trajectory is exactly how I would describe my own trajectory. Like, that's precisely how I would have described it. So I do find his thesis quite plausible. And by the way, let me be clear, like, I'm definitely not calling myself a shaman here. That would be a ridiculous claim to make. I am a scientist. I'm trained as a scientist, obviously. But it is interesting that the way that Williams is describing this process lines up with my own experience. So we can see that the process being described by Paris Williams is the same as this process we've been talking about, right? So his individuals had some relative stability before their psychosis. They had some existential threat, which disrupted that stability. They had this descent into madness as a result of that, what he calls the existential threat, which I think we can think of as an anomaly. And then they reemerged from that into what they described as a higher mode of being. They said that it had lasting benefits, and I've said that too. Jordan Peterson went on a little later after describing the shamanic crisis, and he said this about it, and I quote, "The shamanic process of transformation appears as the means by which cognitive systems are updated when necessary. The affect that is released during the process is necessarily part of the experience. The emotion that's released is part of the experience. Every major step forward, therefore, has some aspect of the revolutionary descent into madness. Change shades gradually from the normal to the radical." Terence McKenna put it this way. He said, "The shaman is not merely a sick man or a madman. He is a sick man who has healed himself." In Maps of Meaning, Jordan Peterson suggested that the shamanic initiatory crisis was really just an extreme example of a more general phenomenon that the psychiatrist Henry Ellenberger called the creative illness. Ellenberger wrote this book called The Discovery of the Unconscious, and he described the creative illness in that book as such, and I quote, "A creative illness succeeds a period of intense preoccupation with an idea and search for a certain truth. It is a polymorphous condition that can take the shape of depression, neurosis, psychosomatic ailments, or even psychosis. Whatever the symptoms, they are felt as painful, if not agonizing, by the subject, with alternating periods of alleviation and worsening. Throughout the illness, the subject never loses the thread of his dominating preoccupation. It's often compatible with normal professional activity and family life. But even if he keeps to his social activities, he is almost entirely absorbed with himself. He suffers from feelings of utter isolation, even when he has a mentor who guides him through the ordeal like the shaman apprentice with his master. The termination is often rapid and marked by a phase of exhilaration. The subject emerges from his ordeal with a permanent transformation in his personality and the conviction that he has discovered a great truth through our new spiritual world." In Maps of Meaning, Jordan Peterson points out that something like this seems to have characterized the lives of people like Friedrich Nietzsche, who experienced some very terrible psychological and physical illnesses early in his life, and Carl Jung, who had a period of quasi-psychosis preceding one of his most creative periods of his life. He had visions. He had a visionary experience. Charles Darwin had some psychological unrest. Jean Piaget and Tolstoy and Freud, right? All of these people were characterized by lengthy periods of psychological unrest, either preceding or during their some of their most creative years. So back to relevance realization, right? What is the relationship between all of this and relevance realization? And so in Maps of Meaning, Jordan Peterson explicitly describes the process of exploration and update, which is the metamythology, as the process by which we determine the motivational relevance of novel stimuli. I'm going to read something he said here, and he says it, he words it kind of strangely, but whatever, I'll read it anyways. He said, and I quote, "Exploratory behavior allows for classification of the general and a priori motivationally significant unexpected into specified and determinate domains of motivational relevance." What he means there is basically when we come into contact with some truly novel phenomenon, we have to determine what the implication of that phenomenon is for how we should act in the world, right? We have to categorize it in terms of its motivational relevance. And that's what this exploratory process allows us to do. So we talked earlier about the fact that in terms of relevance realization, problem formulation is necessary in order to deal with ill-defined problems and the pervasiveness of combinatorial explosion. We have to put a frame around problems, right, to constrain the search space. We have to put a frame around them so that we can ignore most of the world and most of the aspects of the problem and zero in on some small subset that we believe are going to be relevant. But of course, as we talked about earlier, sometimes the way we've formulated the problem constrains that problem in such a way so that it cannot actually be solved. In that case, the problem formulation itself becomes problematic. And in those circumstances, what we have to do is we have to allow that problem formulation, that frame, to be broken up and reformulated. And that's the same thing as breaking up the order, right? It's the same thing as breaking up Osiris, as far as I'm concerned, and as far as Jordan Peterson is concerned, though I expect many people won't like that formulation of it. But it's that, that's a narrative representation of that process, as far as I'm concerned. We have to allow the frame to be broken up and reformulated. And my sense is that the creative illness, what Ellenberger called the creative illness, is just a sort of extreme manifestation of that process, right? It's a long, drawn-out, extreme manifestation of the process by which we reframe the world when we are confronted with some existential anomaly. And it typically occurs when one of our deepest or most fundamental frames or stories has been disrupted. But we see how that process plays out at many different levels, right? So, if you're going to work and then you realize all of a sudden that you had a dentist appointment that day, right? Well, that's an anomaly too, right? And when that happens, right, we kind of experience a tiny little crisis, right? A little baby psychological crisis. And we have to figure out what to do, right? Well, what are we going to do about this? Are we going to go to the dentist appointment? Are we going to go to work? What are we going to do, right? And so that same process, right, plays out even at very small levels. But when it's something small, we don't experience this huge psychological unrest, right? We experience that when it's something that gets at something very fundamental to our way of life. And so it's kind of a fractal in that way, right? It plays out at every level of analysis, but in small issues, when things are going basically well and we only have little anomalies to deal with, it doesn't cause that much psychological unrest. But when it's a big deal, it does. So relating all of this back to self-organized criticality, right? This process that we talked about in the first video. So you may recall that criticality, the term criticality in the context of complex systems, it refers to this narrow window between order and chaos. It refers to the narrow window between ordered and chaotic dynamics. And as we talked about, Jordan Peterson suggested that the hero stands at the border between order and chaos. And I don't think that's a coincidence. You may recall that when a system is at criticality, it goes through periods of relative stability punctuated by avalanches, and those avalanches reconfigure the system and they result in an increase in complexity, or at least they can result in an increase in complexity. The metamythology, as described by Jordan Peterson, is characterized by periods of stability punctuated by periods of chaos, followed by a reemergence into a higher form of order. I don't think that overlap is a coincidence either. Recall that criticality has been argued to represent the optimal pattern of behavior for all biological systems. That's an argument that's been made multiple times in the scientific literature. Mythological narratives, I've argued here, were formed through a cumulative process of telling stories about admirable people engaging in creative behavior and abstracting out the general pattern in those stories. And that suggests that they too are conveying the optimal pattern of behavior, the most general pattern underlying optimal behavior. So, what is the function of mythological narratives? And I'm going to read what Jordan Peterson wrote here about this, about the function of myth and stories in general. When we're construing the world, we talked in the first video about how there are these two ways of construing the world, right? That you can construe the world as a place of objects, a place of things, and that's generally the scientific way of construing the world. But you can also construe the world as a place to act, a forum for action. When you're construing the world as a forum for action, what you need to know, most fundamentally, what you need to know is what you should be aiming at. What should be your highest value? And your highest value according to these narratives, right? According to these mythological narratives and according to the scientific evidence I've talked about here, and we'll talk about more of that in a later video. What you should be aiming at is not any kind of state in the world, right? It's not getting money. It's not being happy. It's not attaining any kind of a state. It's rather the enactment of a process, right? You want to enact and embody a process. And so Jordan Peterson describes how stories can help us in doing this. He said, and I quote, "We use stories to regulate our emotions and govern our behavior. We use stories to provide the present we inhabit with a determinate point of reference, the desired future. The optimal desired future is not a state, however, but a process, the intrinsically compelling process of mediating between order and chaos. Identification with this process, rather than with any of its determinate outcomes, that is, with any idols or fixed frames of reference or ideologies, ensures that emotion will stay optimally regulated and action remain possible, no matter how the environment shifts and no matter when." And so the point here is that this mythological hero figure provides an ideal to imitate, right, and to identify with, right? And you should recognize, right, and because it's true as far as I'm concerned, that what you are most fundamentally is not who you are right now, and it's not order and it's not chaos, right? It's that process, right? You are the process that updates yourself in the face of anomalies. You are the process by which you become who you could be over time. You are the process by which you fulfill your potential over time. That's the same thing, right? You are that process. And when you really identify with that, right? When you fully identify with that, it allows for emotion to stay optimally regulated because change becomes a part of your identity, right? You are not anything static, right? You are that which flows through the world. And the mythological hero figure is an ideal to imitate and to aim at being, right? You want to be that, not to attain a kind of state, but you want to be that process because you are that process. And through identification with that process, it facilitates what John Vervaeke calls relevance realization, or at least the optimization of relevance realization, which is the general pattern underlying optimal behavior. So we talked in the first video about Eric Hol's theory of dreams and how mythological narratives may be serving the same role as dreams do, right? Eric Hol argued that dreams serve to help avoid overfitting our cognitive models to the world. And when we talk about avoiding overfitting, we're talking about having models that are generalizable, that is, models that can be applied to many different situations. Mythological narratives, I would suggest, are attempting to provide a generalizable model of how to act in the world, of how to be in the world. And the hero myth is our collective attempt to convey that pattern of behavior, this pattern of behavior that can generalize to any situation. Jordan Peterson said about this, and I quote, "The behavior of the culture bearer, the archetypal hero, constitutes embodiment of an elaborate procedural code. This code is the end result of an evolutionary process, consisting of the establishment of creative behaviors in the course of heroic endeavor, their subsequent communication in imitation and its abstract forms, and their integration over time into a consistent pattern of behavior, whose nature and expression constitutes the cultural character. This cultural character is the central personality of the healthy individual. Ideally, this character tends towards harmonious balance between tradition and adaptation and the needs of self and other. It is the constant attempt to accurately represent such character that constitutes the aim of the stories of humanity." Aim is in quotation marks there, and that's the end of the quote. Aim is in quotation marks there because it's not like we consciously knew what we were doing, right? We are compelled to tell stories, right? We love stories. We love, people spend some of the most expensive artifacts of our era are going to be these superhero movies, right? And Star Wars and things like that, right? We love stories and we'll pay lots of money for them. And so we do this, it's not like we explicitly aim at doing this, but it is the kind of implicit aim that's in it. And we do this because we need to do it, right? We need generalizable models of how to act in the world. Eric Hol has argued that this is in large part what fiction is helping us to do. It's helping us to avoid overfitting, which means helping us to generalize, and that is the function of mythology. So when Nietzsche declared the death of God, right? That's his most famous line. And what I would suggest is that declaration represented our departure, right? He was announcing our departure from this dream, this ancient dream out of which we emerged. And of course, that dream had become corrupted over time. Everything becomes corrupt over time. And I have no illusions about the lack of corruption within mainstream Christianity at that time and to this day, and the Catholic Church and things like that. But it is an important question, right? If this dream had some utility, and I think it does. How might we return to that dream out of which we emerged? And what I would suggest is that we have to come, now that we are scientific creatures, right? We are scientifically informed. We have to come to consciously and explicitly understand that process that is implicit in mythological narratives, while aiming to enact and embody that process in our own lives. And what I'm going to argue in the next part of the series, what I'll suggest, is that enacting that process is equivalent to participating in the process of creation itself. And my contention is going to be that truly understanding this process, right, having a full scientific understanding of it and its relation to the structure of reality, re-enchants the world, right? It makes the world meaningful again, and simultaneously provides an objectively valuable ideal to aim at, both of which can serve as a response to the meaning crisis. And I would suggest that this new worldview represents a return to the dream out of which we emerged, although hopefully with a greater and more differentiated understanding of it. And that is what we're going to be talking about and doing for the next 8 parts of this series. So that is the end of part 2. If you've made it this far, thanks for your time and attention. I hope it's been useful to you in some way or another, and I hope to see you on part 3. Goodbye. Testing. 1, 2. Does my hair look okay? Okay.